Thanks, folks, for being here with us today. Bonjour, bienvenue tout le monde. And I'd just like to say on behalf of all of us, the team here at Fourth Space, we really appreciate you coming in person or joining us via Zoom for The Sphere, a new ecologies of funding for the performing arts with our special guest, Erik Bordeleau, who's here with us in Fourth Space. Concordia University's Fourth Space is located on unceded indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, and for those of you who aren't familiar with our operation, we essentially collaborate with our community, our university community, to connect people to what's going on at Concordia, namely in terms of the diverse initiatives and research projects, as well as conversations that are in development across the university. So we've had the pleasure of working with the kind of planning committee for In.Site all week this week to explore sustainable practices and pedagogies in fine arts. And to that end, we are very pleased to have Erik here with us to tell us more about his project. I'll just, before passing it over, Erik, I'll just mention that if you're in the space and like to jump into the conversation in due course, just let us know that you'd like to speak, raise a hand, and we'll get a microphone to you so that we can hear you on the recording and so that the folks on Zoom can hear you as well. And if you're in Zoom, you know the rules of engagement. All right, over to you, Erik. Thank you for being here.
Thanks a lot, Anna. You can hear me well? Okay, great. Okay, so let's get started. Thanks a lot for the invite. Thanks also to the Value Collective for making the connection with this event, which is a really good fit with what the Sphere is about. So I'm going to tell you about a project that I've been working on for the last 3-4 years called the Sphere. We like to say that we're working on new ecologies of funding for the arts. Can you see the screen? I hope I'm sharing the screen right now. Okay, great. So what you're seeing is the website that is, I guess, the gateway on our little universe. So we like to say that we're exploring ways for people to redistribute the risk and opportunities of making art and allow for ways of involving the audience, our invested audience, artists, collectors, everyone participating basically in the ecosystem of performing arts into the process of generating live art. And there's many dimensions to the project. I hope I have time to go through, but I guess the best way to maybe get a first dip into the project is through the voice of Ole Strandberg, co-founder of the project. He co-founded Saint-Laurentin and de Wilder. They're the circus company behind this experiment. So let me see if we can start with this little video. This is a video that we presented. We won a grant, a Creative Europe grant, and this is the video that we presented as like the initial sharing with the other laureates of the grant.
Hi, my name is Ole. I'm an artistic director, a circus artist, and one of the founders of The Sphere. Right now, at the end of 2020, the need for an alternative organizing system for the art world is more obvious than ever. We propose a system that distributes power differently between actors and stakeholders and incentivizes artistic inventiveness rather than stifling it. The Sphere is a radically innovative P2P community platform that enables the performing arts ecosystem to initiate creative collaborations and implement new funding strategies. With the Sphere, we want to create a space where the circulation and experience of value is felt differently. A space that allows us for common risk-taking, trust and collective compositions beyond what is deemed possible. In the Sphere, everyone is already an entrepreneur taking from the in-between and an entrepreneur giving to the in-between. We are always already at stake with each other, partnered all the way down. Artists and audience brought together to share the risks and opportunities of making art. But how do we transform the traditional modes of value capture and open it up for the benefit of the community? How do we transform economic loops into social and artistic flows and back? One thing is clear. The time for merely complaining about one's precarity is over. With blockchain technology, economy is now a design question. This is the age of monetary experimentation. The financial class doesn't have the monopoly over risk-taking practices or the craft of its instruments. The economy, as we know it, needs a full reset. Everyone knows it, but no one seems to know how to proceed. We need to undo business as usual. We need to undo the economic forms that hold us mesmerized and captive. We need to make our economy weird again.
So this is a pretty strong declaration of intent. We came in the question of funding with a fairly radical approach, I guess, inspired by the potentialities opened by crypto, blockchain, Web3 technology. So let me maybe share the screen again. Where can I find that? Is it working? I can't see my... Okay, here we go. So, yeah, there's one aspect that's really interesting with working with circus artists is that when you deal with the question of funding or finance more generally, finance has kind of like monopolized the notion of risk-taking in our collective imaginary. And it's very interesting to use performing arts and circus more specifically as a way to transform the relation to risk and maybe bring it back to a more embodied form of collective experience. And it's very interesting when you speak with circus artists, they don't necessarily foreground the risk-taking aspect of their practice, but rather the trust that allows for the risk-taking to happen, like the actual value creation in live art. And that's something that's very interesting for us because that kind of like bridges one of our leitmotif within the sphere. We talk about having differential skin in the game. So inspired by Nassim Taleb, a famous financial thinker, he talks a lot about having skin in the game as a way to make things consequential. And it's very interesting to talk about skin in the game at the live art level. What does it mean actually? And it probably means even more than it would mean at a financial level. So we're playing it with different levels here. We set up a funding campaign that we call the Karmic funding campaign because we're working with the creation of little digital souls to assist artists in creating new ecologies of funding. So we're playing with these languages that might sound esoteric at first, and we're very happy to create the ambiguity, but basically it's because we are not only dealing with money, but with the conditions by which we gather people, money, resources into a space that will be mutually transformative. We talk a lot about the weirding of art and value flows. So how to move beyond the divide between the art that gets presented on stage and the funding that is basically corresponding to the backstage or the back end, if you want to talk in more like programming terms. So the Sphere is a project that got financed by Creative Europe over 3 years. We're entering in our 3rd year. It's a research creation project, which means that the first year was all about research. It was organized around 3 axes. One is the Anarchive, which is concerned with how to connect the informality, the emergent aspect of live art, and the formalization into an economic system. The second one is crypto-economic design, which is really about exploring new tools, Web3 toolings, and we're like very active on that front. We have a great tech provider partner called Curve Labs, based in Berlin. And the third axis of research is accounting otherwise. So really opening up the thorny, difficult questions of value in different ways. And in that axis, we are working among many other approaches. We like to say we use front-end approach to explore the back end or the financial dimension or the positive unconscious of social life. So we're using LARPs, live action role playing. We did a LARP last year to explore the question of collective fractal ownership. And this year we did another one where we projected the sphere in 2033, and it was called something about reclaiming our flesh. Like the sphere became too powerful in 2033, and the performers that are part of the sphere ecosystem felt the need to reclaim their flesh back. So LARPs, they are very playful, but they're actually extremely powerful tools to figure out the blind spots that are generated as we're moving forward. So I'm not going to go too much in detail about the research aspect of the project. That was like mainly last year. What I think is more interesting to present today is where we're at. So the actual funding campaign that we've launched, the Karmic funding campaign, because we're serious, we're really trying to create a prototype that will be sustainable and bring new ways of funding for the performing arts. So why Karmic funding campaign? As I said before, because we're working with the idea of digital soul, we're working with the idea that when it comes to funding and the generation of new ecosystem of funding, there's this idea that we first need to draw a magic circle around the precarious emergent initiatives that we're trying to curate, and we're moving at the speed of trust. So drawing the magic circle, moving at the speed of trust, and then when you start exploring economical question, you realize that economy is essentially a mode of existence by which things loop themselves back into existence. Economy needs to loop back somehow. There needs to be what we call a return on investment. It doesn't need to generate a profit, or at least the question of profit needs to be opened up radically, but something of a return needs to happen somehow. It doesn't need to be a monetary return, but something comes back. So how do we set up the conditions so that we are able to receive that which will come back? Is an abstract way of dealing with the form, the economic form. So that's why we talk about the Karmic funding campaign. There's the idea that once you start this machine, when you start playing with the imaginary of the blockchain, you play with forces that make you become irreversible. You know? So how to assume that irreversibility somehow. These are all abstract, philosophical, also playful, at least for me, dimensions, but we try to make them operative. We try to make them consequential for the question, to address the question of funding per se. Maybe before I engage with the mechanism that we set into motion this year, here is the timeline of the sphere. Let me just maybe come back and show you. So, because it's a Creative Europe project, we need to report on our activities. We need to be accountable. So we decided early on that we would have a timeline on our website so we can report as we go. I'm not sharing screen right now. Okay, sorry. I'm going to get back to it then. Where's my... I lost... Okay, here we are. Oh, no, not this one. I'm going to share screen again. Where are we? Sorry. I'm lost in my different screens here. Okay, so, okay, here we are. So we have a timeline so that we can account for our activities. And one of the techniques that we've developed, so basically the danger when you start working with technology as complex as blockchain and the Web3 tooling is that you get a bit caught up by what these technologies promise to do for you. There's always the fantasy of automation that's lurking in the background. And because of the work that we were doing with SenseLab, the Ecologies Institute, which is one of the sources of the project, we always want to make sure that we're foregrounding what appears like minor techniques, but that actually are essential for generating momentum that will allow for the exploration of the different potentialities that are afforded by these new technologies. So one of these technologies, very minor, but extremely significant, is that we created a floating newsletter that is inspired by the principle of peer-to-peer ethnography. So we're generating a network. We're working with a network, an already existing network of circus artists. We have partners across Europe, venues, companies of different kinds. So we already have a network. So it's not the approach like the Web 2.0 approach of build it and they will come, you know, the famous sentence from Field of Dreams, if you remember, in the 90s with Mr. Kevin Costner. So it's not about building a platform and hoping for the thousands and the millions to come to us. It's actually building tools to empower an already existing network of actors. So this is very important, and the peer-to-peer ethnography is a tool so that we get a sense of what's happening on the edges of what's going on within the sphere development. So the floating newsletter is a simple technique with amazing effects where we basically have a rotating committee that each 2 weeks is changing and redacting a newsletter. So in this specific one, the newsletter number 2, I was the wind. Joel Mason, colleague, was the earth. He was kind of like gathering the information. And I think Ulle Strandberg was the sun, so responsible for the diffusion of the information. And at the end of each newsletter, there was a bit of a cliffhanger, like a question that would be addressed to the next newsletter. So here there was the cliffhanger was, where is this anarchival between, how to practice in it and with it in practical terms. So to such an elusive and enigmatic question, there is perhaps only one answer. Happy grant writing season, everyone. So we basically were very self-reflexive about the fact that grant writing is a professional art in its own right. So I often feel that I am a fiction writer in the grant proposal genre. I'm sure that many of you feel the same. And to address it at the Web3 level, we started to play with the notion of Staatskunst, which is a mouthful German notion to talk about the art of statecraft, the art of creating the conditions for the flow of funding. So when you start building new ecologies of funding, you realize rapidly that it's not only about how to manage the money, but rather how to create new financial flows. And that's a slightly different question, and it makes you have to deal with the question of funding at the highest level, I guess, the Staatskunst level, as we like to say. So this is a technique. The floating newsletter is a technique, a simple one, but it allowed for everyone in the network to give a bit of a perspective on what's going on. And that was the very early step of the project. So it was very interesting to see. It's also a way to scout, to explore the dreams, the aspiration, the problems that people want to address through the project. So that was an integral part of the first year of research. And then otherwise we had like all these little labs. I can show you the cryptoeconomic design lab here, which we entitled with Laura Lotti and Jen Dagdalen, "You Can't Be Alone in a Liquidity Pool." So a bit of a tongue-in-cheek appellation. This was deep COVID time. Huh? Everything was online, and we wanted to bring a bit of joy in the question of funding, which is not always easy. So yeah, I mean, sorry if I'm a bit too informal here, but like I wrote a book called How to Save the Common of or From Communism. And these days, working with the sphere really feels more like saving the capital from capitalism. So basically, how do we reclaim the question of gathering financial flows in our own way? It's a tough question, but you can't really escape it if you start working with blockchain technologies, because it's all about that, basically. Or at least that's the perspective in which we address it. Okay, so that was a bit of a prelude or preamble about like different techniques, different ways of approaching the thorny issue of funding. Now, we'll try to show you that we or I can be very pragmatic when necessary. So here are our little diagrams. One is addressed to the investors in the sphere. So this is our user journey, but I guess it's more interesting for you today if I go through the artistic journey. So this is the Karmic funding campaign seen from the perspective of the artist that participated in it. So as I said before, we are deeply rooted in the circus community. When I say circus here, just to make sure there's no equivocation, there's a whole movement, new circus, that bridges with performing arts, with dance, very creative. There's no animals here. It's a reinvention of the circus form, but it still circulates. It's still nomadic, and it's also weird in its etymological meaning, which means to loop into existence. So the Karmic funding campaign started with an open call that we issued for former laureates, the former laureates of Circus Next. Circus Next is a network that selects a few works each year from incoming new artists in the field. So we issued a call for laureates from the last 20 years, and out of which 27 past laureates answered our open call. And then the Sphere community selected 6 projects, and they went to stage 2. So stage 1 is the Digital Soul Portal opens, summoning seed performers. So the 6 performers that were selected became our seed performances, and you will understand soon like what we mean by seed performances. So these performances are meant to be revived and derived. So reiterated and creatively reiterated by new artists. So we're creating a commons, a generative commons, where works become the seeds for future works in a way that is unforeseen, and it's also, it seems like nothing, but it's not enough to just gather resources, gather people, gather goodwill, and say, hey, now let's be in the commons spirit. Let's commonize our resources. We need to also inject a bit of movement, and this is a bit of a bad way to see it, because the movement, especially in the performing arts, always pre-exists. But there needs to be techniques to catalyze this movement into existence, at least within the Sphere ecosystem. So basically, the seed performances are the material by which new performances are iterated in the future. And our model here is a very simple work, very influential in the blockchain space, called The Plantoid by Prima Ferreira de Filippi. So it's basically a mechanical plant that gets fed with cryptocurrencies, and when it reaches its threshold, it makes an automated call for an engineer, an artist, to create a new version of it. So it's a very simple versioning mechanism. And the sphere is also a versioning mechanism, but instead of using a mechanical plant, we're using performances, already existing performances that get revived and derived into new iterations. So this is what we're offering. That was what the open call was about. We told the artist, if you answer the call, you will get the chance to have your work revived and derived into new iterations. So here we are in the second phase of the project, of that process. We call it the enrichment and the unarchiving process. Enrichment, because we're preparing the work to be integrated in a Web3 environment, which means that we're going to attach an NFT to it. Can talk about what it means in the context of the sphere a bit later, but it's basically just a provenance marker so that we can build a lineage out of it. And the unarchiving process, which is more artistic and very interesting because it's basically asking the artist to already prepare their work for future iterations by other people. So what does that mean? How do you prepare yourself to be iterated by other people? This is a way to enact what we call speculative generosity and a way to empower the generative common information. So these were the two, so for the enrichment process, we also build up a 3D gallery. So the works, the live art performances are displayed in a 3D or metaverse environment with an NFT attached to them, and they become a surface of investment. They are in the gallery, and then in the third phase, we open the meta gallery, and then we started what we would call a crowdfunding, basically, and people during about 2 months were able to invest in one of the 6 seed performances in crypto. And that was a little bit hard because, I mean, there's not that many people that at the end of the day are using cryptocurrencies, but also more profoundly, what we're creating is also a way to invest in live art, that is to collect live art, which is a bit of a paradox. How to collect live art? What does it mean to collect live art? So in the context of the sphere, and this is like really an experiment here, we'll see where it goes, but basically because we're attaching an NFT to a performance, you can start imagining that investing, collecting a live performance is about creating the conditions for it to become a generative, derivative work, a work that gets iterated over time. So you're investing not so much in one work, but in the conditions for one work to keep on happening over time. And it's not so clear if the collectors for that type of work already exist, but we do have one in the room right now, one of the happy early stakeholders, very happy with that. And we so we opened the meta gallery, we opened the Karmic funding campaign, and then there's a little bit of a complication. It's because as a Creative Europe holder, we have money for the production. So basically some of the money that we got from the grant, we're investing in our own mechanism, and we distributed this money through a mega vote. So an online or on-chain quadratic voting, which is a technique where you can distribute your preferences in a way that is less harsh than just like voting without the quadratic function integrated to it. So the mega vote determined one laureate, Andrea Salustri, Materia, and so this work is funded. It has funding to revive itself. So Andrea Salustri is going to do a version of his own work with the funding that he got, and we have funding for 2 other iterations from incoming artists. I will tell you a little bit more about that early on. So that was the mega vote, and then we got the funding from the invested audiences. We gathered 11 ETH, so roughly 15, 20,000 Canadian dollars. It fluctuates a lot these days. The market is not going so well. But we have this little pot that is going to be allocated to the incoming artists' proposals. So right now, the Sphere is in the 6th step of this Karmic funding campaign. So it's the incubation phase. And this is a very important one. I think one that has lots of potential for the future, and as a prototype could be iterated in many ways. So now that we have the money, the seed artists, we asked the seed artists to basically make an offer, like to write what became love letters to incoming artists, to express a bit their intent, what they would like their work to, how their work should be or could be interpreted. So it's not like a free-for-all. It's not like, oh, now that you got the funding, it's all in the hands of the incoming artist and the community. There's many discussions here to be had, but like we're not like promising like absolute democracy in terms of the results. We do want the artist to keep a say up to a certain extent about how their work is going to be derived and revived. But it also depends on each artist's sensibility. So here it's really the first iteration, and we are asking ourselves difficult questions about how to formalize the relation between the seed artist and the incoming artists, and what type of contracts will bind the seed artist with the future iterations. And this is going to be blockchained up to a certain extent, you know? So right now we're in a very delicate phase where we're trying to think of how not to over-formalize or over-legalize the transmission, the artistic and value transmission, but at the same time it's better to take it seriously from the beginning and think of different strategies for the formalization process. So we're going to have a lab beginning of October. You're more than welcome to join. It's going to be online, where we're going to discuss these questions. So we're going to have legal scholars. We're going to have people coming more from the smart contract side of things. And we're going to try to figure out what type of formalization would be adequate for this value transmission process and artistic transmission process. And also, we are mobilizing or summoning anarchivists at this moment in time. So the anarchivists in the Sphere ecosystem is another name for the invested audience or for anyone who would like to participate in this process. And that can take different shapes. You can imagine, for instance, a festival that would be built from the ground up, where people would contribute with different propositions on how this festival could go forward, like different anarchivists, formerly known as the audience, making proposals, and these proposals building with one another and eventually becoming an event in due form. So this type of funding structure allows for new type of collective emergence, potentially. But for now, we're keeping it a little bit more reduced. The open call is essentially addressed to circus artists, performing artists, but we are also open to minor proposals that will come and complement and accompany the mainstream of value, artistic value transmission. So I hope it's clear enough, because this stage, the incubation phase, is a very delicate one and full of potentialities. But we insist on iterating this Karmic funding campaign full circuit before exploring these potentialities further. So once the incoming artists have made propositions, they will be listed on a DApp that is created by Black Swan DAO, a DAO-based distributed autonomous organization based in Berlin, a friend of the Sphere, and they created a tool for quadratic funding, for quadratic voting. So everyone that is involved in the Sphere ecosystem will have a say on which propositions will be granted funding. And once this governance ritual is closed, we're going to issue an NFT. There's already an NFT that is attached to the performance, but it's a generative NFT, and it will enter its last phase of transformation for that cycle, and that NFT will then become market-facing. Like this whole process is not open to the market, it's not speculative, it's really meant to intensify the community that is partaking in the creative and the curation process. Once this process is closed, then the NFT becomes public-facing, that is market-facing, and can become an object of speculation, if so we wish. And we are going to make sure that it's all made through a process of fractal collective ownership, so that as many people as possible can become a stakeholder of the performances that are moving forward. So that, I know it's a lot, but at the same time, I think it's pretty straightforward. That's the solution that we came with, the partial solution that we came with, the question of how to explore new ecologies of funding for the performing arts. There is definitely something performative in the very way we're addressing the issue. We're considering funding as an art form. That's the Staatskunst aspect of it. There's like so many dangers. I mean, we can discuss more in details, like the type of challenges that we're facing, but like basically this is pretty much the gist of it. So yeah, if you're interested, I am more than happy to give you the coordinates so that you can participate in the performative contracts lab session that's going to happen early in October. And yeah, thanks for joining.
Does anyone have any comments or questions? PK, I see you.
Thank you so much for that. It's really, really interesting, especially it's not my field, but there is performance and clothing in my field, so my brain is working very hard to get a grasp on what you're saying, and it certainly is very interesting. I might like to participate just as an observer more than... So my question, though, is in the first iteration, if I understood correctly, the laureate was... and you named them, but he's going to do the second iteration himself?
Yeah.
So how does that work into your share economy? Because I liken it to, you know, when artwork goes out into the public sphere, it belongs to the public sphere. But what happens when that artist who gets to the second stage is the one who's doing the second iteration?
In the case of this work, it's because the work was performed a long time ago. So the artist felt like reviving it in the context of the sphere would be interesting in itself. So that's the reason. There was no pre-written rules, so we allowed it to happen.
That makes, yeah, thank you. That makes
yeah.
perfect sense.
Thank you so much. This was really interesting. And I'm probably going to build up on their question, which kind of brings me back to right before when you discussed the lab that is upcoming and how we can include in the contract since the beginning that we can allow the artists to have their words or their preference to the way that they want their art to be interpreted. But this is exactly how art it is. Art exists in the moment that we are. I'm pretty sure an artist, or I'm thinking of experience where friends of mine who had to perform live art and who didn't have a say on the art that they're performing, but they're performing something that they are actually living, and it's their living experience, and they just had a word to say at the end. So all the audience had already built their interpretation of the live art, and the word, or I'm thinking of my English classes or English literature. English or words can have different interpretation based on context. They could be seen differently. So I'm just thinking, how can we allow the artists to relive their live performance even when it has been shared or transmitted into the collectivity of?
There's so many issues and elements to explore here. So one of the issues that we said we would be addressing when we wrote the grant is that blockchain is essentially an archiving technology. So we wrote that the Sphere ecosystem would be a place where artists would feel safe to develop their work, because we could also provide IP, intellectual property management service embedded in the ecosystem, because it's blockchain, you know. But then what does IP management means in the performing arts, you know, when it's about gestures? So there is a version of that. There's like a circus artist / entrepreneur who decided to create an NFT of a juggling act, and each station of the act, you know, it's like maybe 18 NFTs, 18 pictures, like a Moe bridge on blockchain, is now minted, and you can own a move, you know. This is like the most, I don't know, maybe it's a bit harsh to say, it's the most vulgar understanding of what blockchain technology can do. Tokenize everything, encapsulate everything into an ownership form. So then we really had to move beyond that kind of like easy fantasy of ownership. But then, so that's why I was talking about the magic circle. Like, it's more about creating the conditions of protection around a performance or around an initiative, and then what are the ways so that we can allow it to grow, and with less focus on how to protect the intellectual property and more on, if it's generative, then we can trust that other incoming actors and participants will allow it to grow in different forms and shapes. So, I mean, the sphere is not for everyone. It's not maybe for all sorts of arts or for all types of artists. You know, if someone wants to have a tighter control on their art, maybe the sphere is not for them. And within the sphere, I imagine over the next couple of years, there's going to be a kind of like a range, like a templates of like the type of control that the artist can have or would like to have on the derivative works. And I know that some artists are more than happy to check all the boxes for absolute giveaway, you know, and others are a little bit more protective. It's all good, and that's kind of part of the challenge of transmission, basically. So we're quite proud, I would say, that moving away from the kind of like illusion of ownership when it comes to moves and choreographies, and starting to extend it to the collective itself, and create the conditions for that to happen. And yeah, the technology here really boils down to what is the lineage, or like what is the tracing over time, so that something, it's kind of like a reference that you can go back to. And because it's blockchain, the reference is very easy to go back to. Well, yeah.
Thank you so much, Erik. So maybe you can help us out to think about then, if it's not the vulgar format of moves, what is the form, if that's the right word, or the grain that these artists are sharing, if it's not move? For example, in film, you say, well, I want this actor or that actor for my film because I know this person will bring a certain kind of way of interpreting a role, right? So in that case, the talent goes with that body. So in order for that to be propagated, you need the actual body to be present. And in the performing arts, one would think that there's also this idea that it's very much embodied. Therefore, maybe you need bodies in some way to be propagated. But maybe here it's something in between. So what is that grain?
I would say, from the sphere's perspective, we're not too much into the production or like the synergy between the performers themselves. We're allowing for the invested audience to support the creativity of the performers. So we're creating the conditions for funding around these lineages. So it's not the sphere's job to match make the different producers. This is happening at the art level, but we're creating the conditions for the public to accompany the creative process and the curation.
Which brings in this another question, which is fascinating, because you mentioned NFTs at some point. I'll pass the mic after this. NFTs, are they in this collectors, when they become available to collection in principle, it's interesting to think about NFTs as NFTs bound to events or NFTs bound to conditions of event?
Well, they're bounded to performances and to the lineage of performances. So the events become interesting. We want to mark the events in the NFT. That's why we have generative NFTs. So that each time an event affects the performance, the NFT is transformed and takes account of what has happened. So it's like an evolutive contract form, in a way. It's like layers that can be added to the NFT. The NFT is basically receiving or registering what is happening at the analog or embodied level. But it's a representation, essentially. But it's the occasion for exterior audience to engage directly with what is happening, the event of the performance itself. It's like a gateway or a hold on the event.
So I know that you're concentrating on the economics, alternative models, community trust, so on. So have you thought about what this would do in embracing more and more artists than what we can handle at the level of celebration? Like there's only so much money to celebrate so many artists, and do you even think about the idea that this could widen the scope of performers, and with that then maybe also widen the literature around these models and how it expands both, you know, the economics, but also I see outcomes in terms of who's writing about these models and what that means to new ways of thinking about performance and archiving and so on. I see Brian there, and I'm just wondering if maybe he can answer with you how that might affect the writing around these models.
So right now, the academics that are interested in the sphere come more from business schools, organizational studies. They see that there's a new model there that could be interesting. They see the creativity at the organizational level. We have a PhD now that is following us. And otherwise, what you're asking, I think, would be the object of a lab itself, because there's different pathways here. Like, this is a prototype. You can imagine, if it works properly, that it's going to give, that people could use this. It's all open source. People can use it and create their own prototype for their own context. Doesn't need to be in the performing arts. So that could be perhaps contributing to that. But otherwise, there's also the possibility, maybe a little bit more far-fetched, but like imagining maybe in 5 years' time, that the state or public funding would be funneled through a sphere-like structure and then would be funding a given milieu. Because that's one of the starting questions for the spheres, like how do you fund milieus instead of individuals? Which is a question that emerged in the work with the Ecologies Institute. And it's an attempt at addressing that. So best case scenario, the sphere would be able to locate itself within the public funding structure and propose its own way of distribution, because there's a lot of transparency in the accountability that is embedded in the Web3 tooling, for instance, and ways of involving the audience, which is very important in the performing arts. Like when you write grants in that milieu, they always ask you how to do audience development. So the sphere does audience development immediately. We're allowing for the public, the invested audience, to have a say and participation. So there's different ways in which the sphere could grow into some sort of para-public funding apparatus. Otherwise, maybe a tool for more autonomous gatherings. That would be two options, but I think this is something that should be explored further or discussed further.
Just invite anybody online. If you have any questions or comments, you feel free to jump in. You can just speak. Any other comments or remarks for Erik? Of course, you're welcome to stick around and have a private chat with him if you have the capacity. Erik, yeah, okay, awesome. Great. Well, I think then we'll close up the Zoom, and thank you very much for being here.